Stop proving you are wealthy. Every time you explain, show, or hustle for proof, you leak power. Wealth is not displayed in the shadow. It is decreed in the inner world, and then it hardens into fact. Neville Goddard began and ended with a premise so simple, it unsettles the rational mind. The inner world is the only creative reality. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but causally. What appears outside is not the source, not the origin, and not the authority. It is the echo. Yet most people live as though the echo must come first, as though money, recognition, or visible success must arrive before inner certainty is allowed. This inversion is the root of strain. When the inner world waits for permission from the outer, power is surrendered and life becomes reactive instead of creative. Neville often returned to the analogy of the seed planted in secret. A seed does not grow because it is observed. It does not sprout faster because it is discussed, admired, or compared. In fact, constant interference would only disrupt its natural process. Growth happens unseen, beneath the surface, in darkness and silence. And yet it is inevitable. No one digs up a seed every day to check if it is working. To do so would be to destroy the very process one claims to desire. Wealth, when truly understood, follows the same law. It matures in concealment, not exhibition. This is because true wealth exists beyond decay, comparison, and validation. Anything that must be defended can be attacked. Anything that must be displayed can be diminished. But what is assumed inwardly, quietly, and completely lives in a realm untouched by fluctuation. It does not rise or fall with opinions. It does not weaken in the presence of someone else's success. It does not age, rust, or evaporate under scrutiny. Inner possession is not subject to the laws that govern appearances, because appearances are downstream from it. Modern science, in its own language, is now brushing against this ancient truth. Dr. Joe Dispenza speaks of internal coherence, the state in which thoughts, emotions, and identity are aligned. When coherence is present, the system stabilizes. The body no longer signals lack, urgency, or threat. And when the internal state is stable, no external condition has the power to destabilize it. This is not positive thinking. It is not optimism. It is coherence. And coherence is quiet. It does not need to persuade. It simply is. Here, then, is the central realization that will govern everything that follows. What is kept within becomes untouchable, and therefore powerful. The moment wealth is internalized as identity rather than object, it exits the reach of comparison, theft, delay, and doubt. It no longer needs to be proven because it is no longer questioned. The inner world becomes a sealed chamber, a sovereign domain, where assumption is law and feeling is fact. And from that hidden place, without force or announcement, the outer world begins to rearrange itself, not as proof but as consequence. There is a subtle disruption that occurs the moment wealth feels like something that must be demonstrated rather than assumed. The impulse to show, signal, or emphasize prosperity is rarely questioned, yet it carries a precise psychological meaning. Seeking validation is not a neutral act. It is an admission that ownership has not fully settled within. When wealth is truly possessed internally, it does not tremble under silence. But when it is uncertain, it demands witnesses. The world is asked to confirm what the self has not yet stabilized, and in that request, power quietly leaks away. Consider the image of someone carrying large amounts of cash openly, not out of confidence but out of fear. The money is exposed, constantly checked, repeatedly touched, as though vigilance itself could prevent loss. Ironically, this behavior does not secure the money. It endangers it. Attention attracts risk. Exposure invites interference. The very effort to keep it close reveals an underlying belief that it might vanish at any moment. This is precisely how wealth behaves when it is treated as something external that must be guarded through display rather than anchored through assumption. The same dynamic operates on a psychological level. When wealth is paraded, referenced, or emphasized, it is often because it feels unstable inside. The display becomes a compensatory mechanism, a way to reassure the self through the eyes of others. Yet reassurance borrowed from the outside is temporary by nature. It must be renewed, reinforced, and repeated. Each new comparison reopens the question of adequacy. Each new observer becomes a potential judge. In this way, the urge to prove does not quiet doubt. it multiplies it. This is where the disruption deepens. The moment wealth needs defending, it has already been placed in a vulnerable position. Defense implies threat. Threat implies lack of sovereignty. Inner ownership, by contrast, requires no defense because it does not perceive opposition. It is not in dialogue with circumstance. It is not negotiating with outcomes. It exists as a settled fact, and facts do not argue for themselves. They simply remain. Here the reversal begins to emerge with clarity. If proving wealth weakens it, then concealment must strengthen it. Not concealment as secrecy born of fear, but concealment as containment, as internal grounding. When wealth is held inwardly, it stops reacting to the environment. It no longer needs to be inflated by praise or protected from doubt. It becomes quiet, dense, and rooted, and from that rootedness, it gains weight. What is no longer exposed is no longer fragile. What is no longer seeking confirmation begins to operate from authority rather than hope. At some point, a great reversal must occur in the way wealth is understood, or the cycle of effort and insecurity simply repeats itself under different disguises. Most people are taught, implicitly or explicitly, that wealth is something to be accumulated outwardly first and then felt inwardly later. The assumption is that once the numbers change, the identity will follow. Yet experience quietly contradicts this belief. Without an inner shift, new circumstances only produce temporary relief, followed by familiar anxiety in a new setting. The outer display changes, but the inner relationship to wealth remains untouched. Neville insisted that consciousness precedes all appearances, and this is not a poetic statement. It is a structural one. What you consistently assume to be true about yourself hardens into fact, not because the world agrees, but because the world reflects. The display is never the cause, it is the effect. When wealth is treated as something to be shown, it remains external, unstable, and subject to loss. But when it is assumed as a state of being, it moves into a different category altogether. It becomes identity rather than condition. Imagine a vault buried deep underground. It is not visible from the surface, and it does not need to be. Its security comes precisely from its invisibility. The deeper it is placed, the less accessible it becomes to interference. Wealth that is assumed inwardly functions the same way. It does not depend on constant reinforcement because it is not exposed to constant threat. While displays glitter briefly and invite attention, the unseen vault remains intact, undisturbed, and enduring. This reversal also changes the emotional posture of the individual. When wealth is an inner assumption, behavior softens. There is less urgency, less need to signal status, less tension around outcomes. Actions become natural instead of performative. Decisions are made from sufficiency rather than fear of loss. The person is no longer guarding an image, but living from a position of quiet certainty. This is why true security often appears unremarkable on the surface. It does not need to announce itself because it is not asking for permission to exist. And here the pivot completes itself. What is secure inside no longer needs defense outside. There is no impulse to prove, because there is nothing to prove. The inner assumption has already settled the matter. The world may take time to reorganize, but it will because it has no choice. It can only echo what has been established within. When wealth becomes an inner fact, rather than an outer performance, the struggle to maintain appearances dissolves. What remains is a grounded, unshakable sense of ownership that does not rise or fall with circumstances because it was never placed there to begin with. If this is settling something inside you, stay here, subscribe, and keep what's yours within. There exists a domain that remains largely unexplored by those who live exclusively through appearances, yet it is the only territory that truly belongs to you. Neville referred to this domain as imagination, not in the casual sense of fantasy, but as the fundamental substance of reality itself. This inner world is not an escape from life, it is life at its source. What unfolds there is not subject to permission, competition, or interference. It is sovereign, and because it is sovereign, it cannot be invaded by circumstance, opinion, or chance. To understand this, it helps to see the inner world as a private kingdom. It has no borders because it does not exist in space. It has no enemies because nothing external has jurisdiction there. No one can enter uninvited, and nothing can be taken without consent. In this kingdom, assumption is law and feeling is decree. What is accepted as true there becomes true everywhere else in due course, not by force but by inevitability. The outer world does not challenge this inner authority, it submits to it over time. Most people underestimate this inner realm because it leaves no immediate evidence. It does not announce itself with applause or validation, yet its power lies precisely in this invisibility. The moment imagination is recognized as sovereign territory, a profound shift occurs. Attention withdraws from constant reaction to circumstances and returns to authorship. Instead of asking what the world is doing, awareness settles on what is being assumed, and assumption, once stabilized, is immovable. When this inner world is stabilized, behavior changes naturally without effort or performance. Choices align themselves with the assumed identity. Reactions soften. Patience increases. There is less compulsion to control outcomes because outcomes are no longer the reference point. The reference point becomes the inner knowing of what one is and has. This is not discipline, it is coherence. The outer actions simply follow the inner arrangement, just as a shadow follows a body without instruction. What makes this inner world untouchable is not resistance, but independence. It does not require the outer world to cooperate in order to remain intact. Praise does not inflate it. Criticism does not diminish it. Delay does not threaten it. It remains whole because it was never placed in the hands of circumstances. And from this place of quiet sovereignty, wealth, stability, and fulfillment emerge as expressions rather than pursuits. The world responds not to effort, but to the settled authority of an inner state that no one can touch. Whenever identity is unstable, display rushes in to fill the gap. This is not a moral judgment, but a psychological mechanism. When being has not yet been assumed, performance becomes necessary. The outer world is used as a mirror to answer an inner question that has not been resolved. Who am I in relation to wealth? In the absence of a settled answer, symbols, signals, and displays are recruited to speak on one's behalf. They attempt to project an identity that has not yet been quietly accepted within. Neville understood identity not as something earned, but as something assumed. One does not become wealthy by convincing the world. One becomes wealthy by occupying the state inwardly until it feels natural. When this has not occurred, the self remains in motion, constantly adjusting its presentation. Display becomes a form of rehearsal rather than expression. It tries to simulate ownership without actually resting in it. And because simulation requires maintenance, it never produces peace. The analogy is simple and precise: wearing a uniform without holding the rank. The clothing may resemble authority, but authority itself is absent. Every interaction then carries a subtle tension because exposure is possible. The fear is not that others will disapprove, but that they will see through the performance. This fear keeps attention outward, scanning for reactions, measuring responses, and adjusting behavior accordingly. The inner world remains unsettled because it is still waiting for confirmation. When identity is assumed quietly, display loses its function. There is nothing left to compensate for. The need to signal dissolves not through restraint, but through irrelevance. Wealth no longer needs to be announced because it is no longer being questioned. The individual stops trying to look like something and begins to move as something. This shift is subtle yet unmistakable. It expresses itself as ease, as naturalness, as a lack of urgency around perception. Here the pivot becomes clear. Identity becomes real when it is assumed quietly. Not hidden out of fear, but held without noise. When wealth is internalized as "this is who I am," rather than "this is what I show," behavior reorganizes itself without strain. Choices align. Patience replaces impatience. Confidence loses its sharp edges and becomes grounded. And the outer world, no longer being asked to validate identity, begins instead to reflect it, calmly, steadily, and without drama. There is a delicate threshold between waking and sleeping, where the usual rigidity of identity begins to loosen. And it is here that Neville located one of the most decisive movements of consciousness. He called it the state akin to sleep, not as a mystical escape, but as a functional condition in which the mind becomes receptive without becoming unconscious. In this state, the critical faculty that normally argues with new assumptions grows quiet, and the deeper layers of self are allowed to accept impressions without resistance. This is why ersatz is not about effort or strain. It is about access. It grants entry to the level where identity is formed and reformed. During ordinary waking awareness, the mind is constantly negotiating with appearances. Sensory input dominates, memory intrudes, and imagination is quickly corrected by what is perceived as real. In contrast, sats suspends this hierarchy. The outer world temporarily loses its authority, and imagination rises to the foreground, not as fantasy, but as fact. What is accepted in this state bypasses surface doubt and moves directly into the subconscious structure that governs behavior, perception, and expectation. This is not a symbolic process. It is a conditioning of being. The analogy of a fireproof safe is precise here. Carrying something valuable openly requires constant vigilance. One must check that it is still there, protect it from damage, and guard it from loss. The mind treats wealth the same way when it is not internally secured. It is monitored, worried over, and defended against imagined threats. But when a document is placed in a secure vault, the nervous system relaxes. Attention is freed. There is no need to keep reaching for it, because its safety has already been settled. Sats functions as this vault within consciousness. What is impressed during this state is not an image to be maintained, but a feeling of ownership to be lived from. Neville emphasized feeling because feeling is what the subconscious recognizes as truth, not excitement, not anticipation, but the calm familiarity of having. When wealth is felt in this way, it registers as normal. The body adjusts to it. The emotions stabilize around it. The identity subtly reorganizes itself to accommodate it. From this point forward, wealth is no longer something hoped for. It is something assumed. This assumption does not remain confined to the inner world as a private comfort. It expresses itself outwardly through a quiet reorientation of life. Decisions begin to align with the state that has been sealed. There is less desperation in action, less urgency in timing, and less emotional volatility around outcomes. The individual no longer scans the environment for proof, because proof is no longer needed internally. This is the paradox Neville pointed to repeatedly. When the need for evidence dissolves, evidence appears. Once sealed in ersatz, wealth becomes insulated from external contradiction. Temporary setbacks no longer register as threats, because they are no longer interpreted as verdicts on identity. Comparison loses its grip, because the inner reference point has shifted. Even delay changes its meaning. Instead of signaling absence, it is understood as reorganization. The person moves through the world with a different rhythm, not rushing to arrive, because arrival has already been accepted inwardly. What gives ersatz its enduring power is that it does not rely on constant repetition or conscious maintenance. An impression, once accepted at this depth, continues to operate without supervision. It influences perception, filters experience, and arranges behavior automatically. This is why Neville described the outer world as reorganizing itself. It is not being manipulated, it is responding. The inner seal alters the pattern, and the pattern expresses itself naturally. To seal wealth in sats is to remove it from the realm of anxiety and place it in the realm of certainty. It is no longer carried, displayed, or defended. It is held. And what is held at this level of consciousness cannot be taken by circumstance, opinion, or delay. It may take time to fully unfold in visible form, but its reality is already established. From this point on, life does not move toward wealth as a goal. It moves from wealth as a state that has already been claimed within. There is an adversary that does not arrive with force or hostility, yet it quietly undermines inner wealth more effectively than any external obstacle. Comparison rarely announces itself as a problem. It often appears reasonable, even motivating, disguising itself as awareness or ambition. But beneath this surface, comparison performs a subtle theft. It pulls attention out of inner possession and places it back into external measurement, where identity becomes conditional and wealth once again feels provisional. Comparison operates by shifting the reference point. Instead of wealth being measured against an inner assumption of sufficiency, it is measured against someone else's display, progress, or timeline. The moment this shift occurs, the inner seal weakens. The mind begins to ask whether it has enough, whether it is ahead or behind, whether its state is legitimate. This questioning does not arise from lack in reality, but from a divided focus. Inner riches are not lost because they were insufficient. They are obscured because attention has wandered. Neville often warned against judging appearances precisely because appearances are incomplete. They are fragments of someone else's bridge of incidents, not final outcomes. To compare oneself to them is like measuring your home against someone else's blueprint. A blueprint is not a finished structure. It offers no information about timing, material, or context, yet comparison treats it as verdict, drawing conclusions that have no foundation in reality. The result is unnecessary doubt, introduced into a state that may have been perfectly intact moments before. The real danger of comparison is that it reopens the need for proof. Inner wealth, once assumed, does not require constant reassurance, but comparison invites scrutiny. It asks the mind to re-evaluate what was already settled. It tempts the individual to check, adjust, or compensate, subtly reintroducing performance where identity had begun to stabilize. This is how comparison steals without being noticed. It does not take wealth away directly. It erodes the certainty that sustains it. As attention withdraws from comparison, something important is restored. Authority returns to the inner world. The individual stops tracking progress through external markers and begins to feel progress as internal alignment. This shift is not dramatic, but it is decisive. Emotional reactivity decreases. Envy loses its charge. Admiration no longer implies lack. Other people's success ceases to threaten because it is no longer interpreted as competition. The inner world regains its position as the primary source of truth. In this restored authority, wealth becomes self-contained again. It no longer rises and falls in response to what others appear to have or achieve. The mind returns to its own rhythm, its own unfolding. Time feels less compressed. Urgency dissolves. There is a renewed sense of trust, not in circumstances, but in the inner arrangement that has already been established. This trust does not need reinforcement because it is not based on comparison. It is based on coherence. When comparison loosens its grip, inner riches are no longer exposed to theft. They are no longer measured, questioned, or weighed against external standards. They simply are. And from this place of restored authority, the outer world continues its reorganization quietly and steadily, reflecting a wealth that no longer depends on being ahead, visible, or validated, but on being inwardly owned and therefore secure. When inner wealth has been quietly assumed and stabilized, there comes a point where life begins to move differently, not through dramatic announcements, but through a series of ordinary events that seem to fall into place with unusual precision. Neville referred to this sequence as the bridge of incidents, emphasizing that it is not something constructed by conscious effort. It unfolds as a natural consequence of an inner state that has already been accepted as real. The bridge is not designed by the intellect. It is arranged by consciousness itself. What makes this process difficult for many to recognize is its lack of spectacle. The bridge does not arrive with certainty or explanation. Each step appears reasonable on its own, often even mundane. A conversation leads to an opportunity. A delay redirects attention. A chance encounter opens an unexpected path. At the surface level, nothing appears extraordinary. Yet in retrospect, the coherence becomes undeniable. Events align not because they were forced, but because they were required to express an inner assumption now seeking outer form. This is why Neville insisted that the bridge unfolds without announcement. Consciousness does not need to explain its movements to the analytical mind. In fact, explanation often comes later, after the outcome has already materialized. During the unfolding, there may even be moments of uncertainty, where the connection between inner assumption and outer movement is not yet visible. But the absence of clarity does not indicate absence of order. It indicates that the order is deeper than surface logic. The analogy of doors opening is particularly fitting here. Doors do not open because they are knocked down. They open because one belongs behind them. When inner wealth has been assumed, certain environments, opportunities, and relationships simply recognize that belonging. Access is granted without struggle. Invitations appear without pursuit. Obstacles dissolve without confrontation. There is a sense of being led rather than pushed, guided rather than driven. What distinguishes this phase from earlier efforts is the emotional tone that accompanies it. True confirmation feels calm, not triumphant. There is no surge of excitement demanding validation, No impulse to announce arrival. Instead, there is a quiet recognition, a feeling of familiarity, as though life is finally matching something long known internally. The nervous system does not spike. It settles. This calm is the signature of authenticity. It signals that what is appearing outside is not new, but simply catching up. As the bridge continues to unfold, trust deepens naturally. Not blind trust, but experiential trust. Each aligned event reinforces the understanding that the inner world truly governs the outer. This understanding does not inflate the ego, it stabilizes it. There is less temptation to interfere, less need to control timing, less anxiety about how things will work out. The individual moves with life rather than against it, recognizing that effort is no longer the primary force at play. In this way, wealth reveals itself without being chased. It appears as a byproduct of inner alignment, not as a reward for struggle. The bridge of incidents carries the individual from assumption to experience seamlessly, without spectacle or strain, and because the process is calm, it does not disrupt inner stability. Wealth arrives not as something gained, but as something recognized, confirming what had already been quietly possessed within. There comes a stage in the unfolding of inner wealth where striving naturally gives way to rest. Neville referred to this state as the Sabbath, not as a religious observance, but as a psychological and spiritual condition. It is the moment when the assumption has been so fully accepted that effort becomes unnecessary. The mind stops pushing, correcting, or checking. There is nothing left to achieve internally because ownership has already been claimed. What remains is a quiet resting in what is known to be true. This rest is marked by emotional neutrality, not indifference, but steadiness. When wealth is truly possessed inwardly, it no longer provokes excitement or anxiety. Both are signs of uncertainty. Excitement reaches forward toward something not yet owned. Anxiety looks backward at something that might be lost. The Sabbath stands in neither direction. It is present, grounded, and complete. The emotional system no longer swings in response to appearances, because appearances are no longer the source of truth. The analogy of a locked door captures this state precisely. When you trust the lock, you do not repeatedly check it. You do not test it, reinforce it, or worry about it throughout the day. The matter is settled. Attention moves elsewhere, not because the door is unimportant, but because it is secure. Inner wealth, when it reaches the Sabbath, functions the same way. It does not occupy constant mental space. It does not require monitoring. It simply exists as a given. In this resting state, time changes its character. Urgency dissolves. The future no longer feels like a destination that must be reached as quickly as possible. Instead, it feels like a natural continuation of what is already established. Patience arises without effort because there is no sense of waiting. The individual is not trying to get somewhere. They are allowing something already accepted to unfold. This shift in relationship to time is one of the clearest signs that the Sabbath has been entered. The Sabbath of wealth also brings a deeper realization of self. As the need to secure outcomes fades, attention turns inward in a new way. Identity is no longer defined by results, progress, or comparison. It rests on being rather than becoming. This does not lead to passivity. It leads to clarity. Actions taken from this state are precise and unforced. They arise from alignment, not pressure. Life becomes responsive rather than reactive. What is most striking about this phase is its ordinariness. There is no dramatic moment announcing arrival, no emotional climax, no external confirmation required. The Sabbath is recognized by its simplicity. The mind feels quiet, the body feels settled, the sense of self feels whole. And from this place of rest, the outer world continues to rearrange itself naturally, reflecting an inner possession that no longer needs effort, attention, or defense, because it has already been fully assumed. The teaching returns to a single, unwavering truth. What is assumed within cannot be threatened without. Once wealth is accepted as an inner fact, it no longer depends on circumstances, timing, or approval. It exists prior to evidence and therefore outlives fluctuation. True wealth requires no witnesses, because anything that needs to be seen is still negotiating its reality. What is genuinely owned inwardly matures in silence and expresses itself only when expression is natural. Neville's mirror analogy remains exact. The reflection never moves first. The world responds faithfully to inner certainty, not to display or effort. This is why inner coherence, as Dr. Joe Dispenza describes, produces external order that cannot be shaken. When identity, feeling, and assumption align, instability dissolves. In this quiet alignment, wealth is no longer pursued, it is rested in. As Neville reminded, the secret is to feel secretly. What is felt in silence becomes untouchable, and what is untouchable inevitably reveals itself. Subscribe, keep your inner wealth private and powerful.